The Texas sun beat down on Fort Hood's training grounds like a hammer on steel, but Sergeant Maya Stanley didn't sweat. She stood at the edge of the obstacle course, clipboard in hand, watching Bravo squad struggle through their morning PT with the detached interest of someone who'd seen too many recruits think they were special. Her scarred face remained expressionless as Private Jake Morrison, 6'2" of entitled muscle and misplaced confidence, deliberately slowed his squad's time by showboating on the rope climb. Morrison Maya's voice carried without being raised a skill learned in places where noise meant death. You just cost your squad their breakfast. Maybe hunger will teach you that this isn't Friday night football. Her slight limp was barely noticeable as she moved to mark their time, but Morrison's eyes tracked it like a predator sensing weakness. "Whatever you say, Scarface," he muttered just loud enough for his squad mates to hear. The nervous laughter that followed would become a pattern over the next 3 weeks. Jake pushing boundaries while Maya responded with nothing but professional distance, her silence interpreted as weakness by someone too young and stupid to recognize strength. What happened next would teach Private Morrison and Bravo squad that some people earn their scars in places where mockery is a luxury no one can afford. Fort Hood sprawled across central Texas like a small city dedicated to the business of creating warriors. In 2024, it remained one of the Army's premier training installations, where raw recruits were transformed into soldiers through a combination of tradition, technology, and the kind of brutal honesty that only comes from those who've seen combat. The base's training cadre included every type of instructor, from fresh-faced sergeants on their first assignment to grizzled veterans counting days to retirement. Sergeant Maya Stanley occupied a unique position in this ecosystem. At 32, she was younger than many senior NCOs, but carried herself with the weight of someone twice her age. She'd arrived at Fort Hood 6 months ago, assigned to training duty after what her personnel file listed only as extended medical leave. The file itself was curiously thin for someone of her rank. No unit history, no deployment records, just basic information and a security classification that prevented casual inquiry. Her appearance told a different story. The right side of her face bore a network of scars that looked like someone had tried to piece her back together from fragments. Her left arm, when visible during PT, showed similar damage, raised white lines against brown skin that spoke of shrapnel and surgery. She walked with a slight favor to her right leg, noticeable only when she was tired or when the weather changed. But it was her eyes that disturbed people most, flat, 1,000-yard stare that looked through recruits rather than at them. The other drill sergeants had learned to work around her peculiarities. She never joined them at the NCO club, never shared war stories, never participated in the casual bonding that made military life bearable. She arrived precisely at FOSSA 500, performed her duties with mechanical excellence, and disappeared after 1700. Some thought she was arrogant. Others suspected she was broken. None guessed the truth that Maya Stanley was holding herself together through pure will and routine, that training recruits was her penance for surviving when better soldiers hadn't. Private Jake Morrison represented everything Maya had come to despise about peacetime military. Son of a car dealership owner from suburban Dallas, he'd joined the Army for the GI Bill and the resume padding, treating basic training like an extended football camp. His high school glory days were recent enough that he still expected deference, still believed physical prowess trumped everything else. At 21, he'd never experienced real hardship, never faced a situation where his strength and size weren't advantages. His harassment of Maya began subtly eye rolls during instruction, whispered comments to squad mates, small acts of disrespect that danced along the edge of actionable offense. He'd identified her as the weak link in the training cadre hierarchy, the instructor who wouldn't scream or throw creative punishments at them. In his limited worldview, her quiet professionalism was weakness. Her scars were disfigurement rather than honor. Her limp was vulnerability rather than the price of valor. The other recruits in Bravo's squad were typical of their generation, diverse in background, but united in their uncertainty about military life. There was Chen, a first-generation immigrant using the Army as a path to citizenship. Williams escaping poverty in Detroit. Thompson following 3 generations of military service, and a dozen others each, with their own reasons for signing up. They watched the dynamic between Morrison and Stanley with varying degrees of discomfort, but none had the courage to intervene. Morrison was their squad's natural leader, physically gifted, charismatic, in the way of people who'd never faced real adversity. Challenging him meant social isolation in a world where belonging meant survival. The escalation began during the 3rd week of training, when the Texas heat had worn down pretenses and revealed true character. Maya was demonstrating proper combat medical techniques, her hand steady, as she showed how to apply a tourniquet under fire. Her expertise was obvious to anyone paying attention, the muscle memory of someone who'd performed these actions when they mattered. "Now remember," she said, cinching the tourniquet on the training dummy, "you have about 3 minutes before blood loss becomes critical. In combat, that's where you got those scars." Sarge Morrison interrupted, his tone mock innocent. "Combat. Or was it a really bad day at the motor pool?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the squad, quickly suppressed when Maya's eyes found his. "Push-ups, Morrison. Start counting." Her voice remained level professional, no emotion, no rise to his bait. As Morrison dropped and began counting, he continued talking. "Just wondering, Sarge, you never tell war stories like Sergeant Rodriguez or Sergeant Carter. Makes a guy curious, whether some people just look the part." Maya watched him struggle through push-ups in the Texas heat, her expression unreadable. At 50, when his form began to fail, she spoke. "Recovery position. Chen, you're up. Demonstrate the tourniquet application." The pattern continued throughout the week. Morrison's comments grew bolder, his audience larger. He mocked her limp during ruck marches, made jokes about her appearance during chow, questioned her credibility at every opportunity. Maya responded with nothing but assigned duties and professional distance, which Morrison interpreted as victory. "I'm telling you," he told his bunkmates one evening, "she's probably some admin clerk who got hurt stateside and managed to wrangle a training position. Real combat vets don't just take that kind of disrespect." Thompson, whose grandfather had served in Vietnam, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe she just doesn't think you're worth the energy, Morrison." Or maybe, Morrison shot back, "she knows I see through her act. All those scars and mysterious silence, classic stolen valor. Bet she's never been closer to combat than a Call of Duty marathon." The breaking point came during a night navigation exercise. Bravo's squad was learning to move tactically through woodland Maya, observing from checkpoints. Morrison, designated as squad leader for the exercise, deliberately led them off course, then blamed the error on following Scarface's confusing instructions. When they finally reached the extraction point an hour late, Maya was waiting. Squad leader explained the delay. Morrison smirked. "Got turned around, Sarge. Maybe if our instructor could walk properly, she could have shown us the route better." He bumped her shoulder as he passed, not hard enough to be assault, just enough to show disrespect. Maya stumbled slightly, her bad leg betraying her. "Watch it, Scarface," Morrison added loud enough for everyone. "Maybe you should retire before you hurt yourself again. Leave the real soldiering to people who can handle it." The squad held its breath, waiting for the explosion. Other drill sergeants would have destroyed Morrison, would have had him doing push-ups until he vomited, would have made his life a living hell. Maya simply straightened, adjusted her gear, and made a note on her clipboard. "Squad dismissed. Morrison report to my office at 0600. But Morrison never made it to that meeting. General Victor Sterling's arrival at Fort Hood was unscheduled and unannounced, the kind of visit that sent ripples of panic through the command structure. At 0545, his convoy rolled through the gates heading directly for the training grounds. The three-star general was known for his surprise inspections, his intolerance for mediocrity, and his photographic memory for faces from his 30-year career. Maya received the alert on her phone at 0550 just as she was preparing for Morrison's disciplinary meeting. She felt the familiar tightness in her chest, not fear, but the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd spent years trying to disappear only to be dragged back into visibility. She knew Sterling by reputation and history. He'd been a colonel during Operation Ghostline, had written the after-action report that classified most of the details, had pinned medals on empty coffins, because the bodies were too damaged for open caskets. By 0615, Bravo Squad was assembled on the training ground, Morrison front and center, with his usual cocky stance. He'd skipped the meeting with Maya, assuming her silence the previous night meant he'd won their war of wills. The other recruits stood at attention, nervous about the unexpected brass but excited for the break in routine. Maya stood to the side with the other drill sergeants, her scarred face carefully neutral as General Sterling emerged from his vehicle. He was smaller than his reputation suggested, with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much. His inspection began routinely reviewing training schedules, examining equipment, asking pointed questions that made even senior officers sweat. Then his gaze found Maya. The change in his demeanor was instant and profound. His professional mask slipped, revealing something raw, recognition, respect, and what looked like pain. He walked toward her with purpose, leaving his aides scrambling to keep up. The training ground fell silent, everyone sensing the shift in atmosphere. When Sterling reached Maya, he did something that stunned every person present. He stopped, came to perfect attention, and rendered a salute sharp enough to cut glass. Not the perfunctory greeting between ranks, but the kind of salute reserved for Medal of Honor recipients, for heroes, for the living legends that most soldiers only read about. "Widow 27, he said, his voice carrying across the silent field. "I didn't know you were back in training rotation." The effect was immediate and devastating. Every soldier who'd served more than 2 years knew that call sign. Widow 27 wasn't just a person, it was a legend, a ghost story told in combat zones, a case study in impossible survival. The lone survivor of Operation Ghostline who'd done what training manuals said couldn't be done. Morrison's face went through a transformation, confusion to recognition to horror. The woman he'd been mocking, whose scars he'd ridiculed, whose service he'd questioned, was the most decorated living soldier most of them would ever meet. Sterling wasn't finished. He turned to address the assembled squad, his voice carrying the weight of command and history. "Recruits, do you know who's been training you? This is Staff Sergeant Maya Stanley, though in certain circles she's known by another name. 6 years ago, she was part of a joint special operations task force inserted into a classified location in eastern Syria. Their mission was to extract a high-value target who had intelligence on an imminent chemical weapons attack." Maya stood frozen, her jaw clenched so tight it was visible even through her scars. She'd spent 6 years running from this moment, from this recognition, from the weight of being the only one who walked out of that hell. "The mission was compromised," Sterling continued. 7 operators went in. They were ambushed by a force 10 times their size. The extraction helicopters were shot down. Communications were jammed. By all rights, every American should have died that night. He paused, letting the weight settle. But Sergeant Stanley, then Sergeant First Class Maya Chen, refused to accept those odds. After her unit was overrun and she was wounded by multiple IED blasts, she managed to stabilize 2 critically injured teammates. When it became clear no rescue was coming, she made a choice that defied every odd. Morrison had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning cool. Around him, his squad mates were putting pieces together. The scars, the limp, the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen the absolute worst humanity could offer. "She carried them." Sterling's voice had dropped, but it carried clearly in the morning air. 12 miles through enemy-controlled territory, her right leg was shattered from shrapnel. Her face and body were torn apart by an IED that killed the 4 other members of her team instantly. But she carried Lance Corporal Martinez and Sergeant First Class Thompson on a makeshift litter she built from their equipment. For 18 hours, she evaded enemy patrols, treated their wounds with supplies scavenged from dead enemies, and refused to leave them behind. Maya's hands were clenched at her sides, trembling slightly. This was her nightmare, not the memories of that night, which visited her regularly, but having it laid bare before people who couldn't understand. Every word Sterling spoke felt like another layer of carefully constructed anonymity being stripped away. When the rescue team finally found her, she was unconscious from blood loss, her body covering her teammates. Martinez and Thompson survived because she literally used herself as a shield during the final firefight. 26 American and Allied operators died in the larger operation. She saved the only 2 who could be saved at a cost that would have killed anyone else. Sterling reached into his pocket and pulled out a small case. Sergeant Stanley was awarded the Medal of Honor, the Purple Heart, the Silver Star, and the Distinguished Service Cross. She's the most decorated female soldier in modern history, and she asked for all of it to be classified, asked to disappear, asked to be allowed to serve quietly, without fanfare. He turned to Morrison specifically, his eyes hard as flint. "Private Morrison, you've spent 3 weeks harassing a woman who earned every one of those scars, carrying better soldiers than you'll ever be through hell. You knocked into someone whose spine was fractured in 3 places from carrying 180 pounds of dead weight while being hunted. You called Scarface someone whose face was rebuilt after she used her body to shield wounded comrades from a grenade." Morrison looked like he might vomit. His squad mates had backed away from him unconsciously, as if his disrespect might be contagious. The weight of his actions mocking someone who'd literally carried the dead and dying on her broken body was crushing him in real time. Sir, Maya spoke for the first time, her voice rough. "Permission to speak freely." "Granted," Sterling said. "I didn't want this." The words came out, strained years of suppressed emotion bleeding through. "I asked to be forgotten. I asked to serve quietly. These recruits don't need to know." "Yes, they do." Sterling cut her off, but his tone was gentle. "Because they need to understand what real service looks like, what sacrifice actually means, what those scars represent." He turned back to the squad. "Every time Sergeant Stanley walks across this training ground with that limp, she's choosing to continue serving despite pain that would cripple most people. Every time she demonstrates combat medicine, she's using skills that kept people alive in conditions that would break your minds." Maya's composure finally cracked. "They died," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying in the silence. "Torres Washington, Kim Patel Johnson Davies. I gave them morphine and held their hands and lied about rescue coming. I took their ammunition and their water and left their bodies for the enemy because I couldn't carry everyone. Don't make me a hero for choosing who lived and who died." The raw pain in her voice was devastating. Morrison had tears streaming down his face, the full weight of his actions hitting him. He'd mocked someone who carried survivor's guilt like a physical weight, who wore scars both visible and invisible from a night that defined heroism and horror in equal measure. "You're not a hero for choosing," Sterling said quietly. "You're a hero for carrying, for refusing to leave them all, for turning an impossible situation into 2 lives saved." He looked at the assembled recruits. "This is what service means. Not glory, not recognition, but doing what must be done even when it breaks you." The morning had gone still, even the usual sounds of the base seeming muted. Maya stood exposed in every sense, her carefully maintained walls demolished by truth she'd never wanted spoken. The recruits saw her now not as their quiet, scarred instructor, but as someone who'd walked through hell and chosen to keep serving despite everything it had cost her. "Private Morrison." Sterling's voice turned cold again. "Pack your gear. You're being transferred to a unit that might teach you some respect. Perhaps cleaning latrines for a few months will give you time to think about what real sacrifice looks like." "Sir," Morrison managed through his tears, I'm sorry. I didn't know." "That's the point," Sterling cut him off. "You assumed, you mocked, you targeted someone you perceived as weak because it made you feel strong. Real soldiers don't need to tear others down to build themselves up." The dismissal of Morrison should have been the end of it, but Maya stepped forward. "Sir, request denied." Her voice was steady now, the initial shock of exposure giving way to something else, the same determination that had carried her through 12 miles of Syrian hell. Sterling raised an eyebrow. "Sergeant, Private Morrison stays with Bravo Squad." She turned to face the young man who'd tormented her for 3 weeks. "He's here to learn. Let him learn." Morrison's mouth opened and closed without sound. Around him, his squad mates watched in disbelief as the woman he'd called Scarface advocated for him to remain. Maya walked closer, her limp more pronounced now, as if revealing her story had also meant stopping the exhausting pretense of hiding her pain. "You want to know where I got these scars, Morrison?" She didn't wait for an answer. "The one across my jaw is from Corporal Washington's rifle stock when an IED threw him into me. This one on my neck is from using my body to drag Martinez through a window while under fire. The ones you can't see are from the infections that nearly killed me because I used all our medical supplies on them instead of myself." She rolled up her sleeve, showing the full extent of the damage. "Every scar has a name attached to it. Every limp step I take reminds me that I'm walking when 6 others aren't. So mock them if you want. Call me Scarface. Make your jokes. But know that every insult you throw at these scars is an insult to the people who died earning them." Morrison dropped to his knees, overwhelmed. "I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. I couldn't—" "Get up," Maya commanded. "Soldiers don't kneel except to help the fallen." She turned to address the entire squad. "You want to know why I don't tell war stories? Because the real ones aren't entertainment. They're not about glory or being badass. They're about 19-year-olds crying for their mothers. They're about choosing which wounded to save because you can't save them all. They're about living with those choices every single day." General Sterling watched with something like awe as Maya took control of the moment, transforming exposure into education. This was why she was Widow 27, not just for the physical feat of survival, but for the strength to keep serving when most would have shattered. "Bravo, squad," Maya continued. "You have 10 weeks left in training. You can spend them feeling sorry for me or sorry for Morrison, or you can spend them learning what it really means to serve. Your choice." She looked at Morrison. "You stay, but you earn it. Every day you earn the right to wear that uniform by respecting everyone who's bled for it." "Clear. Clear, Sergeant." Morrison's response was immediate, desperate. The squad's training transformed from that moment. They attacked every exercise with newfound intensity, understanding that their instructor wasn't just teaching from manuals, but from experience written in scar tissue. Morrison became the most dedicated recruit Fort Hood had seen in years, pushing himself and his squad mates not for glory, but for the right to serve alongside people like Maya. During combat medical training, they paid attention with religious focus, knowing their instructor had used these skills when they mattered most. During ruck marches, when their bodies screamed for rest, they watched Maya's steady pace with her damaged leg and found strength they didn't know they had. During night operations, when fear crept in, they remembered that their sergeant had navigated worse darkness and survived. Sterling observed several more training sessions before departing, each time rendering that same respectful salute to Maya. Before leaving, he pulled her aside. "You could have any posting you want. Pentagon, War College, anywhere away from this." "This is where I belong, sir," Maya replied. "These recruits will go on to lead soldiers. Maybe if they understand the real cost, they'll make better decisions. Maybe they'll bring more people home." The revelation of Maya's identity rippled through Fort Hood's training cadre. Other instructors began sharing their own stories, not for glory, but for education. The culture shifted from bravado to honesty, from war stories to war truths. Recruits learned that heroes rarely looked the part, that the quietest person in the room might be carrying the heaviest load. 6 months after the revelation, Bravo Squad graduated as the highest performing unit in their training cycle. Morrison was selected for additional leadership training, his transformation from arrogant recruit to humble soldier complete. At the graduation ceremony, he sought out Maya in the crowd of instructors. "Sergeant Stanley," he said, rendering a perfect salute, "I wanted to thank you, not just for the training, but for the lesson. I've been visiting the memorial wall reading about Ghostline. I put flowers there every week." Maya studied him, seeing genuine change rather than performance. "Don't thank me, Morrison. Thank them. And when you're in charge of soldiers, remember that every decision you make could put someone else in my position. Make those decisions worth their sacrifice." The story of the confrontation spread through military channels, becoming a teaching moment about assumptions, respect, and the hidden costs of service. Maya's identity as Widow 27 became an open secret at Fort Hood, but she was never treated as a celebrity. Instead, she was given what she'd always wanted: the space to serve quietly, with the understanding that her scars had earned her the right to that peace. Dr. Patricia Chen from the VA reached out, offering specialized therapy for the trauma Maya had compressed for so long. "The body keeps the score," she explained during their first session. "You've been carrying more than just physical scars. Maybe it's time to let some of that weight go." The therapy was brutal, forcing Maya to confront not just the night of Ghostline, but the years of isolation that followed. She learned that hiding hadn't been healing, that anonymity had become another form of punishment she'd inflicted on herself. Slowly, carefully, she began to build connections, first with other instructors, then with a support group of combat veterans who understood the weight of survival. A year later, Maya accepted a position developing combat medical training protocols, using her experience to potentially save lives she'd never meet. Her manual, simply titled "When Every Second Counts," became required reading at combat medic schools. She insisted it be published without her name, but those who knew recognized the hard-won wisdom in every page. Morrison wrote to her regularly from his posting with the 82nd Airborne, sharing his own journey of leadership and the lives he was working to protect. Other members of Bravo Squad did the same, creating an informal network of soldiers who understood that strength came in many forms, that scars were stories that silence could speak volumes. The memorial wall at Fort Hood gained a new addition, a small plaque honoring Operation Ghostline, listing the 26 who died and acknowledging the 3 who survived. Maya attended the dedication ceremony, standing between Martinez and Thompson, the 2 soldiers she carried to safety. They flanked her like honor guards, their own scars, testament to her refusal to leave them behind. "You saved our lives," Thompson said, his voice thick with emotion he'd held back for years. "We saved each other," Maya corrected. "You gave me a reason to keep moving. Every step, every mile, you reminded me that some things are worth any price." General Sterling retired the following year, his final official act ensuring Maya received the recognition she'd avoided, not through public ceremony, but through quiet improvements to veteran care, trauma support, and training programs that acknowledged the invisible wounds of service. Her story became required study at military academies, taught not as glorification of war, but as testament to the price of survival. 5 years after that morning confrontation, Maya stood before a new group of recruits. Her scars had faded slightly with time, her limp had worsened with age, but her presence commanded respect without needing explanation. She began every training cycle the same way: "My name is Sergeant Stanley. These scars you see aren't decorations. They're reminders. Reminders that your job is to bring each other home, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. That the person beside you might one day carry you through hell, so treat them accordingly." She never mentioned Ghostline, never spoke of medals or call signs. But sometimes, when demonstrating combat techniques, recruits noticed the practiced ease of someone who'd learned these skills when they mattered most. They saw the slight pause when she handled medical supplies, the ghost of memory crossing her scarred features. They learned, without being told, that their instructor had walked through darkness and chosen to become a light for others. Jake Morrison, now a staff sergeant himself, kept a photo in his office, not of Maya, who still avoided cameras, but of the Ghost Line Memorial. When young soldiers showed disrespect or arrogance, he'd share his story of the recruit who mocked a hero's scars, who learned that strength and sacrifice often came in packages we didn't expect. He'd end with the same message: the deepest scars often belong to the strongest souls. Never mistake silence for weakness. Sometimes it's the sound of someone who's already screamed enough for one lifetime. And sometimes, if you're lucky, that silent person will teach you what service really means. The legacy of that morning at Fort Hood lived on in every soldier trained by Maya Stanley, in every life saved by combat medics using her techniques, in every leader who learned to look beyond surface appearances. Widow 27 had wanted to disappear to serve in anonymous silence. Instead, she became proof that true strength wasn't about being unbreakable. It was about choosing to serve even after being broken, about carrying others when you could barely carry yourself, about teaching the next generation that scars were just the visible evidence of invisible courage. In the end, Maya Stanley's greatest victory wasn't surviving Ghostline or saving 2 lives against impossible odds. It was transforming a moment of cruel mockery into a lifetime of meaningful service, proving that heroes don't always look the part, but they always carry each other home.